Welcome to today's programme at the Commonwealth Club World Affairs, the nation's oldest and largest public affairs forum. Every year we present more than 450 forums on topics spanning politics, culture, society and the economy. I'm Andrew Dudley, Chair of the People and Nature Forum, and it's a delight to see so many faces in the audience today. I thank you for taking the time to attend this in-person event at the club. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to our guests who are joining us virtually via our live stream this evening. Our event will run for around an hour or so. Should you wish to ask our guest a question, we have a microphone, which is just over here, where you can ask a question, and that will be in about 45 minutes. It is a distinct pleasure to introduce three guests tonight. Firstly, Matt DeSantos, the Co-Executive Director and General Counsel of our Children's Trust. Second, we have Kalapa from Hawaii, who's a plaintiff in the Navajo and Hawaii Department of Transportation. And Avro from California, who's a plaintiff in the Genesis B versus United States Environmental Protection Agency. Now let's please join me in giving a warm welcome to our guests. So Matt, let's start with you. So a quick first question. So can you take us through where you were born, where you came from, and what led you to doing the work that you do today?
Just a little retrospective, huh? So thanks everybody for being here tonight. It's really great to see you all, and thanks Andrew and the Commonwealth Club for inviting us here today. It's really nice to be here. So I was born in the Commonwealth of Virginia to a couple of immigrants. My mom's from Macau, which was a Portuguese colony back then. And my dad is from a tiny little village in northern Portugal, and his family is from Brazil. And I say that because it really heavily influences the way I think about the world, right? And the connections that we have with each other, irrespective of where we are in the world. And so sort of fast forward, I went to school here in California. I actually went to UC Irvine, where I studied biology. Then I went to Cornell for law school after a stint in doing biology and ecological work, so doing environmental conservation work. I decided I could make a difference by being a lawyer. Then I lived here in San Francisco for a while and worked at a law firm just up the street called Morrison and Foerster, where I cut my teeth as a lawyer, and then went into nonprofit world a few years back when I took a job at the ACLU. At the time, Obama was president, and then soon thereafter, Trump became president, and we got very busy. And it was a wild ride, but I had an opportunity at the end of 2019, early 2020, to join this organization called Our Children's Trust, which was doing cutting-edge constitutional legal work in the environmental space. And for me, that was like a perfect confluence of events. I got to combine my background in science with my love of constitutional litigation and taking a rights-based approach to solving some of the world's problems. So that sort of brings me to where I am today. I'm up in Portland, Oregon, and I get to work with amazing folks like Avro and Kalalapa, and young people who are trying to make a difference in the world today using our court systems, both here in the United States and around the globe.
Excellent, thank you. And to help us set the stage, could you provide us with a brief history of our Children's Trust and how you became involved with that organization?
Sure. So our Children's Trust was founded in 2020 by Julia Olson, who was an environmental lawyer who had become frustrated with the progress she could make taking a project-by-project approach to resolving environmental problems. For folks who are sort of familiar with environmental law, you know that most of the litigation that happens when you challenge a single project or a single power plant or a single pipeline. And the way that it was described, which I think rightly is, you would challenge something and kind of, you might win a reduction in a project or a pipeline or, while you're litigating that one project, 20 more pop up, some of which are even bigger, right? Like larger carbon emitters. And at the time, Julia was pregnant with, I think, her first child, maybe her second child at that point. And she became really distressed at this idea, right? Like she's like, I'm not making progress. I need to find a systemic way to make this change. And she, I think, maybe in the way that we sometimes make promises to ourselves or our family, made this promise to her kids that she was going to find a better way to address this problem and leave the world a better place for them. And out of that idea, and that idea that courts are vital to a functioning democracy, was born Our Children's Trust. And how I got there is a weirdly similar conversation with a family member. My partner Clay went back to school as an adult in environmental sciences and was watching me at the ACLU. I was working on a case in a place called North Bend in Oregon and defending these two queer students from a really evangelical principal who had decided to punish them by making them read parts of the Bible, which to me it was so strange that you would try and punish someone by having them read something that you find so important. And so obviously we got involved, right? We're you can't punish queer people for being queer. You also can't force them to read the Bible in a public school. And at one point, I was just really tired, and Clay came to me and said, I'm really proud of the work that you're doing on behalf of LGBTQ students, but what happens when you secure their individual rights, but there's no longer a world for them to live on? And I was like, what? You can't think of things that way. And they were like, no, I know. You're doing really great work, but is this what, have you thought about that? And I said, yes, no, I don't know. Please don't ask me questions like that. That makes me uncomfortable. And for a year, that was a year before I left to join Our Children's Trust. For a year, I kept thinking about what's my future legacy? What am I leaving? And I'm incredibly proud of the work that I did at the ACLU and the work that the ACLU continues to do defending the rights and liberties of people all across the country. But here I am today because I think that in order for us to have a functioning democracy, we need to have a functioning ecosystem. We need to have a functioning climate system. Because what does our Constitution mean? What do our rights mean? What does that piece of paper mean if we can't breathe air or drink water or the land around us is on fire?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And for Kalalapa, how about you? Where do you come from, and how did you become involved with the Children's Trust?
Aloha mai kako o Kalalapa. I kua nalu Helen kamano kalawa e kamalo konaneo ka'ala winter. Hello, everyone. That's my name. I go by Kalalapa. I am a child of the lands of Ha'ena Kauai and Haleiwa Oahu, which are the north shores of two Hawaiian islands. And I got involved with Our Children's Trust when I was 17. I'm 20 now. I am involved in, I'm the oldest plaintiff in a case called Navahine versus the Hawaii Department of Transportation, in which we are suing the Hawaii Department of Transportation for their illegal excessive amounts of greenhouse gases that they're emitting, and a couple of other things. And I've been doing activism work. I consider myself a land protector, so I've been doing this work for a very long time. My father's an ecologist, so I've been doing a lot of decolonizing, conservation, and sustainability work pretty much my whole life. I work with a lot of indigenous fisheries in my home and around the Hawaiian Islands with learning how to, basically, a lot of biocultural restoration work and decolonizing the way that we approach our fishery management. And then somehow, being in that sphere of amazing people who are doing amazing work in Hawaii, I got involved with this case before it became a case, and I met some people from our Children's Trust. And I don't know, the rest is history, I guess.
As they say. And how about you, Avro?
Yeah, so I got involved with Genesis when I was 14, and I'm 15 now. I'm a freshman in high school. And really just seeing as the pollution from the smoke that comes down from the fires and the floods and everything that we experience on a daily basis, it seems like, a lot of us, the Genesis plaintiffs, have been involved with local climate action for a lot of our lives, but we know that that can only go so far when we're then firsthand experiencing the effects of climate change. So last year, my school had to evacuate twice due to flooding and winds. There were downed power lines on campus and fallen trees. A park that I used to go to regularly, I walked through it after a storm and I saw fallen trees, trees that had been there my whole life, just gone, just like that. And I knew that in that moment, that local climate action that I've been involved in can only go so far. And I had been following the Juliana case, which is, I believe, one of the earlier cases brought forth by our Children's Trust. And I knew, okay, I'm experiencing climate change. Where is that going to go? So I took my story and I brought it to the courts, to the EPA, which is allowing life-threatening pollutions through their discounting of our lives and our futures. And I brought that story to the courts and just wanted my voice to be heard and wanted a future that is livable.
Thank you. So, Matt, can you elaborate on your strategy for youth-powered litigation and explain how your WAVE strategy works?
Sure. So, as Avro just mentioned, we have a couple of federal cases. Juliana versus United States was filed in 2015, has been going on for nearly 9 years now. We also have the Genesis B versus EPA case, which is very different than the Juliana case, even though they're both in federal courts. But one of the it's hard to get lawyers to admit that there might be problems with the legal system, but I'm going to do it for you right now. The federal courts have a problem right now. If you follow any legal news or just general news, you may have heard of some of the problems, like Justice Alito or Justice Thomas. Which isn't to say, and I want to be very clear, isn't to say that we shouldn't be working in federal courts. We should be working in federal courts, right? For folks who care about reproductive rights, you've seen a concerted campaign of trying to attack and roll back reproductive rights for now 4 decades come to fruition, right? They were losing those cases 40 years ago, the cases like Dobbs, which they won. So I think that staying active in our federal courts is incredibly important, but one of the things that like Julia, the co-executive director, and I started talking about, nearly like 4 years ago now, was we need to look at other civil rights movements as a model. And we had already been doing that, but really exploring, for example, the ways in which we moved as a country from cases in the early 1970s about same-sex marriage to Obergefell in 2015, right? That process, that 40-year process or 45-year process was an evolution in strategies, which included going to the federal courts and losing, going to the federal courts and winning partial victories, right? Like Lawrence v. Texas, where sodomy was decriminalized, but it still didn't afford same-sex couples rights. It just meant that police couldn't go into your houses and arrest you for who you chose to have intercourse with. But what we really saw was people acting on a state level, taking cases to state constitutional courts and creating a federal tipping point, right? Where enough states had either a right to marry a person of your choosing, irrespective of their gender, or some sort of smaller version of that, right? Like domestic partnership, or civil marriage. And once we advanced that strategy to the point where we were in 2012, 2011, when Obergefell was first filed, there were enough states that were doing this that I think it was impossible for the Supreme Court to continue to ignore this new constitutional right that same-sex couples had to marry the person of their choosing. So, Julia and I were like, well, we got to get serious in state courts. And so we've been bringing cases in state courts around the country, including a case that we recently brought, not so recently, we brought it in 2020, but went to trial in Montana in 2023 and got this incredible ruling out of the Montana First Judicial District Court, which is going up to the Supreme Court in Montana, which may surprise you to learn is significantly better than the US Supreme Court on these issues. So we expect to win there. We will be litigating that case this summer. And we're going to court in Hawaii. So we have a trial scheduled in Hawaii and starting on June 24th against the Department of Transportation for their unconstitutional emissions. And you'll be seeing us filing more cases in state courts. We have cases in Utah and Virginia. Currently, we'll be filing in cases in a number of other states with this idea that over the next 3 years, we'll be bringing new waves of litigation with different configurations around states' structures or structural sort of fossil fuel systems, right? And so I mean that to be like extraction systems in states like Texas or Oklahoma or Montana, where they're, investing deep amounts of money in heavily carbon-intensive infrastructure, or in states like Hawaii or California or Massachusetts, which are much bluer and don't have as much extraction, but are still deeply involved or deeply invested in carbon pollution around like transportation sectors, agriculture, industry, et cetera. And so, as we continue down this process, I think that essentially our goal is that, by 2030, we would be having, we'd have a victory in many states, maybe somewhere between 30 and 50% of the states, which I think would enable us to really push the federal legislature forward and the federal court systems forward to acknowledging what we all, I think, understand to be true, which is that our fundamental documents can't mean anything unless we actually have a world in which to use them.
These constitutional protections, are they unique to the United States, or do other countries have them?
So that's, I guess that's a pretty straightforward question. They are not unique to the United States, and in fact, there are many states that don't have express constitutional protections. There are 6 states currently that have express constitutional protections for what people think of as like green amendments. But there are many states that have other constitutional protections for the environment, including almost every state actually has some sort of protection for natural resources written into their constitution, either like expressly or sort of more through the protection of wildlife or other, natural resources. And around the world, you're seeing more and more of these constitutional protections pop up. They might not call them the constitutions, like in Canada, it might be like the articles or whatever, but they're essentially the same, these foundational documents that are guides for how these societies are kind of constructed. And probably not surprising, but newer constitutions, like Montana's constitution is actually from 1972, 1971. Hawaii's constitution is relatively new. as well, newer constitutions tend to have environmental protections in them, whereas older constitutions don't. And even though the United States is a relatively new country, our Constitution is actually one of the oldest constitutions currently in existence in the world, because most countries their constitutions have evolved over time. Our Constitution is really fantastic in some ways, but one of the things that our founding fathers did to sort of protect the Constitution was make it sort of difficult to change. So we're kind of stuck with it now. And one of the things that I think is great about it, though, is that unlike some of the constitutional problems I mentioned earlier, like Alito and Thomas, most, I think, legal scholars think that the way the Constitution was written enables us to interpret it in an evolution, right? As we evolve as society to understand what we need to function. And so that kind of construction of our Constitution, I think, enables us to find these constitutional rights in these federal cases.
Okay. So Matt mentioned the lawsuit that you're involved in. Can you give us some background as to what it is you're asking for?
Yeah. So our lawsuit is called Navahine F versus the Hawaii Department of Transportation. There are 13 plaintiffs, not including myself, so 14 including myself. The other 13 are all younger than me. They're all legally not adults. Our youngest plaintiff is about a decade younger than me, so I believe she's like 9 or 10. Basically, like Matt was saying, the way that we are able to sue them is through our Constitution. So in Hawaii State Constitution, it says that we have a legal right to healthful lives in Hawaii. Every single one of our plaintiffs have either had our livelihoods or our health impacted by the climate crisis. And we have ranging of different stories. For me personally, I'm involved in the case because in 2018, Hawaii rains a lot, and everyone's very aware of this. It's very green. But in 2018, in my home community in Ha'ena, Kauai, and a couple of communities surrounding us, on the North Shore of Kauai, we were hit with what is considered the first documented climate disaster in Hawaii, and it was 55 inches of rain, it's about 1.5 meters of rain in less than 24 hours. And as you can probably guess, that pretty much decimated our community. And it was incredibly traumatizing for me because Hawaii is not like the continental US, not like any of these big cities. We kind of stay the same in like our homes. And similar to what Avro was saying, it's really weird to be used to something your entire life and then one day it's just gone and everything you care about is destroyed and all the beaches you loved are gone. And like, it also really messed up our main water source, which is a huge deal for my community. And it also really messed up our marine ecosystems because of the flooding and all the sediments from the flooding. And I'm a fisherwoman and my family's like full of fishermen. We are in a fishery community, so really impacted our livelihoods as well. So that's how I'm involved in the case. We have a couple of other plaintiffs who have flooding experiences similar. One of the plaintiffs I'm closest with, her name is Kaliko. She's 14. She also, in 2018, lost her home to floods in Maui from Tropical Storm Olivia. And then again, many of you probably heard about the fires in Maui. She lost another home in those fires. So she's lost 2 homes before the age of 15, which is like it's so hard to explain how incredibly traumatizing that is. We have a lot of other different stories in our case. And so we are able to sue because of that constitutional right to a healthful environment. Specifically, we're suing the Department of Transportation because Hawaii has to meet a net carbon zero emissions goal by 2045. And obviously, in order for that to happen, all of these large departments that are in charge of a lot of things in our state have to bring down their carbon emissions. And slowly but surely, every single one of them is doing that, almost every single one. And as you can assume, like, we can't go from 0 to 100 or 100 to 0 in like a snap. It takes years for decarbonizing to happen, especially in like Hawaii's not a very big place, but we do have like a lot of people in like one area type of thing, because the majority of the islands, like, they're all spread out and a lot of them are very rural, but in Honolulu specifically, there's a lot of people in one place, and the island is not very big. So we're basically, the Department of Transportation is the only large department not doing what they're supposed to be doing. Their greenhouse gas levels are going up, which is not what's supposed to happen. It is quite illegal. So that's how we're able to see them. And then we're also, in our case, we do address a lot of things like creating economical ways for individual action amongst the citizens of Hawaii. So that looks like electric vehicle charging stations and safer bike paths, because our bike paths are quite unsafe, and a couple of other things. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. And Avro, can you take us through what you guys have been up to with the EPA and how that's been progressing?
Yeah, so we brought this lawsuit, 18 plaintiffs, including myself, all when we filed under the age of 18. Our case is Genesis B versus EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And we are challenging under the Fifth Amendment, which talks a little bit about equal protection. To say that something that the EPA does is they use these discount rates when they look at children and they say, you're not making as much money, you're not financially independent, not financially powerful, and they essentially discount our lives to be worth less than that of an adult. So then when they use those numbers into calculating the amount of pollution that they allow, those numbers are applied, and that allows for life-threatening pollution that impacts all of us. And in California, at least, where the plaintiffs are based, we have some of the worst air quality in the United States of America, and we are affected all of the time by their rules. So something that the Constitution protects us is equal protection. Under the law, we are currently being deprived of it because of these really inhumane discount rates that are saying that our lives are worth less. The future that we should be promised is just not there to the same degree in terms of potential. We don't have the potential currently to live the same life that someone could have had 50 years ago in terms of pollution, or even today. The life of an adult compared to the life of someone like me or someone younger than me is just not calculated at the same level. We are really just treated less by the EPA. So that really just goes to violate their the equal protection clause, and as people who are being now affected directly from those violations, we brought that lawsuit, and we're being impacted all the time. The lead plaintiff, Genesis, she suffered from extreme heat. I know that many of my other plaintiffs have had problems related to asthma. Another plaintiff, Ione, she lost her house in a fire and had to escape on a wooden bridge that following her evacuation burnt down. So the things that we've been through as a result of our deprivation of equal protection are really just appalling. To know that this is happening and our government is allowing it.
Thank you. So, Matt, I understand that the judge moved to dismiss this case quite quickly. Was that something you expected, and what is your strategy moving forward?
Yeah, so the Genesis case, I mean, it was pretty disappointing. Judge Fitzgerald in the Central District of California, so it's federal court here in California, just last week dismissed the case and essentially applied a ruling from our other federal case, the Juliana case, to dismiss it. We think that ruling was was incorrect. I mean, we obviously think the Juliana ruling was incorrect too, but the application of the Juliana ruling to the Genesis case is incorrect for a lot of reasons, but not the least of which is that those cases are just so very different. But that's okay. Our next step is going to be, so the judge dismissed it, but granted us leave to amend. So meaning that we can take our current complaint and rewrite it to make sure that it meets the standards of law that he set forth. And one of the things that he really focused on as a potential avenue for litigating this case was that the constitutional violation inherent in these discount rates. And what Avro was just talking about, it's it's always tricky to explain this concept because it's a concept that derives from economics that is now being applied really widely in policymaking. But I think just like if you'll humor me for a few minutes, I'll give you a little bit of a background on discount rates. So discount rates were essentially created by the timber industry so that they could value timber property. And the way that they would value timber property is by saying, okay, this piece of land is worth however much the future value of that logged wood is worth. So then they would decide when to cut down the trees based on when they could maximize the value of that wood. So the underlying land was only worth as much as the harvested wood, and that led to this really strange concept that a 700-year-old old growth forest was worth less money than a 40-year-old timber farm because that wood was more valuable on the market. So fast forward to today, the EPA and other government agencies are applying these discount rates to climate policy. And so a climate solution, and I'll get to human lives in a second because it gets even more twisted, but a climate solution that takes 100 years to solve is valued significantly less than one that takes, 10 years. So like, for example, like this thing with lumber, right? Like so a piece of land might be worth $1,000 if you harvest it in 10 years, but if you harvest it in 100 years, it might be worth 80 cents, right? So it creates this really, really sort of strange disincentive to invest in our future. And they now apply it to the value of human lives. And they apply it to the value of human lives when considering the economic benefits of fossil fuel projects. So if you say like this fossil fuel project will generate $1 billion in the next 10 years, and then you compare it to the value of the lives of that community, you can guess which one wins, right? The fossil fuel project that will generate $1 billion because those human lives are significantly less valuable because they're, in Avro's case, maybe he has another 80, 90 years ahead of him. So the value of his life is significantly lower than the value of like the adult that's alive today. It is a complex subject to litigate, but it's really important. And discount rates are being applied everywhere in public policy around us. And I imagine that we will be hearing more and more about them as more and more academics are kind of digging into them today and investigating the weird ways in which our public policy is being driven by these economic considerations that don't really make sense if we're trying to protect the world for future generations.
So just to ask both of you guys, what is it like to, be in a courtroom and have attorneys like Matt speak on your behalf and represent you?
Do you want to go first?
What's that experience like?
Sure. So a couple weeks ago, I was down in LA to hear the government Department of Justice. They had motioned to dismiss the case for a few reasons, and right before we walked into that courtroom, we were told that the judge had, I think it's called a tentative that he released, saying that he didn't think that that our injuries, how we've been affected by climate change in the past, are redressable right before we walked in the courtroom. So, we were like, okay, we're going to go in there with our, faces unfazed, and we're going to be respectful. And we all walked in. We did exactly that. And I heard Julia Olson, one of the lawyers, she talked a lot about a lot of things, but she also talked about the redressability, the part that the judge didn't think that could happen. And she says, yes, what's happened in the past is not something that can be fixed, but what's going to happen in the future to us, based off of what climate change is doing to us, can be changed, and that course can be altered. And she talked a lot about that, and that really resonated with me, to know that, sure, last year my backyard flooded and we couldn't leave our house at times. Sure, smoke has affected me in the past. I've had school canceled due to other climate change induced events. But what's going to happen in the future, that if we keep going down this track, is only going to get worse. And to know that that can be avoided, that's redressability. And that's something that we can change. So it just felt very empowering to know that there is hope if we change our course, and if we value the lives of children like myself to that of equals, of adults, and to give us that chance for a potential equal to that of current adults. And also to know that we as children are more susceptible to the effects of climate change, the smoke, the floods, and there are just so many ways that we can really, really fix that. But the other part of my feelings in that courtroom, as I sat, I felt eerily normal, sitting there. And, I'm up here today also talking, and 10 years ago, I would have been like, what, sitting in a courtroom? But to know that children like myself have to go out there to tell our government, you're doing something wrong and this needs to be changed, that is appalling. To know that they're not already, taking care of the kids, of the future of the world, something that, you would think a government would be tasked with. That is appalling to me, to know that I've been working on climate action since I was in 3rd grade. And the progress we have seen is not what we need. To know that what we're doing is wrong, and yet we're continuing to do it, and that the government is allowing that, all of that is appalling to me. And to know that in that courtroom, as I sat there, feeling just like a normal person, to know that youth like myself working to secure a future that's livable is becoming a norm. Not that saying that we don't have a future that's livable appalls me, and I just want a life that is happy and one that I can live in, and not a life that is plagued by the effects of climate change, from the experiences of having to feeling the urge to do something to have a future. It's just not something that I would rather be doing with my time.
So that's quite relatable, I would say. Yeah, working, I very much agree with what Avros said. Working with our lawyers have been amazing. My case is through 2 amazing firms. One is Our Children's Trust, and the other one is Earth Justice. Some of the lawyers from Earth Justice, because they have a Hawaii base, I've known from other things that I've worked on. Everyone in Hawaii is quite close. Honestly, it's been really, really amazing. I've been told a lot that I should do. Like, my dad's dream for me was to do environmental law. I grew up with an environmental lawyer who is like one of my mentors, and I'm very close with. So I've known a lot of lawyers, and also we're not going to pretend like lawyers can't be scary. I've worked with a lot of mean lawyers, scary ones, and I think that there is. It's weird to say stigma or stereotype, because it's kind of true. There are a lot of lawyers who are just very in this capitalist system where they have to be lawyers, and that bleeds into their other lives and the type of people that they are. And a lot of people believe that there are people born to be lawyers. That's what my dad says about me. That's not my path, but I've been able to meet some amazing lawyers that honestly I had no idea existed through Earth Justice and Our Children's Trust. People that have made me feel very safe and very secure. And like what Avro was saying, it's scary to be in this young generation and fighting for something that no child should have to fight for. No young person should have to fight for their right to exist. And the amount of pushback we've all seen and we've all gotten, and that is happening worldwide to children and youth of our generation for fighting for basic human rights, is disgusting and appalling. But there are two things that keep me doing it. One is future generations and knowing that I will have an impact on everyone who comes after me. Because a lot of people wonder why I care so much. They're like, well, technically you're not a kid anymore. Technically, like, why does this even matter? Is any change really going to happen that's going to affect you? Aren't you going to die before, like, we see this life-sustaining climate ecosystem? Yeah, probably. But to be totally honest, that's not why I'm in it. I'm in it for future generations. And the other thing that keeps me going is our amazing lawyers, people that I feel safe with, that have our backs when we feel really down, that are fighting for us because they believe that we are the current future generation. And they're also people that, as humans, I get along with and I feel safe with. I myself am queer, and I think that, like, a lot of times, especially navigating in spaces in Hawaii, it's not as openly talked about. And I've worked with a lot of amazing lawyers who, like Matt and Paul, and some just amazing people that make me feel so safe and comfortable in myself and in my identity, that I can go out into a courtroom and just, like, be myself and know that there are people who are so knowledgeable and so educated and know the court system so well that I actually have no fear walking into those courtrooms. Even when crazy things get thrown at us, I know that they will always have a solution, which is so amazing to me. Yeah, and I've been doing this for, I think, 3-ish, almost 4 years. I've gotten to know them, and I feel so safe with them. And I know that they have all of our backs, and they have, also the work they're doing is so amazing, like worldwide. It's very inspiring to me. So yeah.
So just before we break to questions from the audience, I have one more question for you both, is how are you balancing your educational and personal life with the demands and responsibilities of being involved in such high-profile lawsuits?
Okay, guys, when we were in the green room, I was talking about, hey, if I don't know if any of you guys have a TikTok, but if you have a TikTok, go follow my new TikTok. I was recently told that everyone is now, like, not doing TikTok, which is weird because I don't know. But, like, if you have a TikTok, follow my TikTok. I'm posting updates about our case. It's also a way for me to connect with my generation and college students my age. I am currently a BFA acting student at the University of Southern California. I'm going into my 3rd year, which is so crazy to me. And I'm from a very small island community, and I'm now living in Los Angeles. So that's a crazy transition. But I started a TikTok to talk about my case, and I was just talking about the most recent video I made. It's like a get ready with me, in which I am doing my hair and talking about frequently asked questions with our case at Coachella while I was car camping. So my like belief that I've or like something I've realized through all of this is it is possible to do it all. It's hard because I'm trying to be an actress. I'm in school full time. For anyone who doesn't know, BFA programs are incredibly hardcore. And I also fly between Los Angeles and Hawaii and wherever I have to be for work, which is a lot to handle. But someone recently asked me like how I don't get burnt out, which I'm not gonna lie, I do get burnt out sometimes. But I've realized that this work is so important and so groundbreaking and inspiring. And I get to see kids who are much younger than me working on these cases. And even though morally I think that they shouldn't have to be, they're also quite inspiring, who are also in school full-time and they don't have jobs. Like I work full-time outside of doing the case and being in school and traveling, so that's a lot. But these kids don't have to do that, but they get to just be kids. And when they had asked me how I don't burn out, I like had to think about it for a second because I was like, well, I do. But I also have recently just learned that this is what I've always known this is what I'm passionate about. But I do believe that finding the passion in this activism that we do, finding the life in it and why we do it rather than looking at it as separate from my life, looking at like, oh, I have school and I have work and I have to do all of this stuff. And then I also have my case, like that's what burns you out. Like thinking about it all is like my passion and the reason I'm alive and my purpose is the way that I balance it. It's a lot, but I've really enjoyed it. I've gotten some amazing opportunities from this case and yeah, it's been amazing.
Yeah, that was really great. Hard to follow that, but you know, they say school is for your future. What future?
Period.
I mean, I go to a public school, Palo Alto High School, Sko Vikes.
But yeah.
And, you know, we're told you're going to go here, you're going to go to college, and then you're going to do a job and live life. And I'm thinking, you know, I'm going to live a life in a planet that's plagued by the effects of climate change. And just living it, it's almost as if the feelings of apathy have just completely taken over the school system. So, you know, I'm getting in trouble today in history before I came here for like talking while writing an essay. And I just sometimes think, you know, what's the point? What's the point of going to school every day when I'm not going to be able to use that knowledge and education to the same extent that someone else could, someone who's an adult right now?
Yeah.
And as someone who's been involved with climate work from third grade, I haven't been involved my whole life. My parents are a doctor, and my mom works at the Federal Reserve Bank. So naturally, out pops the climate activist. But you know, I just am sometimes disillusioned by the education system because I'm just not sure how I'm going to put it to use. The stuff that I'm learning, and yeah, the stuff that I'm learning can be cool. I like my Spanish class; that's fun. But you know, I just feel like the application is to less of an extent that it could potentially be if we had that same equal future. Mm-hmm. And also, while I do a lot of climate work, I end up missing a lot of school. Too many absences. And my school half the time is like, oh, well, you know, if you're doing an extracurricular that's not school affiliated, you need to get approval and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, seriously? You think I'm cutting school to be here?
Yeah.
It's like, I would rather be in school, but hey, climate change is happening and I'm not going to sit around. You can.
Oh, yeah.
I just think that if we're educating children for the future, they should have a future that they can live in.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're just going to thank you. We're just going to open up the floor to questions. So there's a microphone here. And there'll also be an opportunity for you guys to make some final remarks as well. So if we can ask for people, if you can ask a question, please give us your name and keep the question as short as you can and direct it to the person you want to direct it to. Anyone got a question?
Yeah.
Come on.
Hi, my name is Barry Rothman. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Hello, Barry.
Hi. Hi. I've noticed huge amounts of furor on campuses about the situation in Palestine. And very quickly, there was a response, a huge response. And I'm wondering, why isn't that kind of response happening for climate change? And I don't mean that in a blaming way, but what is the dynamic that goes on that makes climate change? This room isn't filled. But if we were having a rally around what's happening in Palestine, maybe it would be filled. Why?
I could take that. I'm involved in at USC. We've had encampments that have gotten national coverage for police brutality, and there is a lot of national coverage on the college campuses for students speaking up. I was involved in the encampments, which I will just say they were quite peaceful. I don't know why my safety was threatened from sitting on a lawn, but that being said, people don't, in my opinion, I believe that there is an aspect of the climate crisis that to so many people is ignorable. And people could say that for Palestine, and that is why, if we look at the history of what has happened in Palestine, it hasn't been spoken about for as long until right now. And this is why, when there are huge climate disasters, like a ginormous fire in Lahaina, like the wildfires or the big fires that happen in California, that's when people start talking about it for a little bit. And then when it becomes ignorable, people ignore it. There are people who cannot ignore it. A huge percentage of those people being indigenous people, being people of color, being low-income people, being people from islands like me, because we are constantly facing erosion of our islands from rising waters and rising ocean temperatures affecting our coral reefs. There are people who cannot ignore it, which is why I think the Hawaii case is such a big deal right now, especially in Hawaii, because people are caring more than, let's say, the Montana case is a huge deal. Not that many people in Montana understand the impacts of climate change. And I think right now what's really interesting about what's happening in Palestine, and I've said this before, is that for the first time ever in history, we are seeing something that is being live streamed everywhere. It is on social media everywhere. You literally cannot escape facing the realities of it. Whereas facing the realities, some people can. They can just turn off their phones, block whoever they want to block, and ignore the issue, right? And that's why there's not as many people talking about it as we would like. But with the climate crisis and the effects of the climate crisis, it's so easy to ignore. It's so easy to just chalk up, oh yeah, the fires, they just happen. Oh yeah, there's floods in LA, they just happen every couple of years, and ignore the issues. And it isn't until people are dying and there are huge impacts. I don't know if you all remember in New York a couple years ago where no one could see anything. More people started talking about it. And then we all go back into our lives and a lot of people forget. And then there's not as many people talking about it, I'm also gonna put out there that social justice and fighting for beliefs throughout the course of the world and also through the history of America, change really only happened when people started noticing some form of huge pushback, whether it's violence or riots or boycotts that changed the way that the way that the economy was working. That's when people start noticing, you know what I'm saying? And I think with the climate crisis, it's not as, we're not rioting. We're sitting on a stage, and what we do is important, but it's a different form of getting people to recognize what we're doing than what's happening with the Palestinian encampments on college campuses and so on.
Thank you. Avro, would you like to?
Yeah, I'd just like to say that, the climate movement, as some call it, has been going on for a long time, well before I was born. And there have been setbacks for a long time. So when it first launched, the first Earth Day, people came out in the millions in America, demanding that we stop this climate change, this climate crisis, and put an end to it. But, that change didn't happen. And, you see the events in the news and then they go away. Because otherwise, there's also a lot of events that don't get reported in the news around the world that should and do not get international recognition, just because people get bored of reading the same stuff every single day in the newspaper. Right? So that's one part of it. People don't want to see fire here, flood here, hurricane here every single day. They want variety. So I'm
That's true.
really shocked to recognize that climate change can bore people, but the reality is that it does. And as much as I would love to see millions come out every single day, that's just not a reality that is achievable. Because I was talking with a friend a few days ago, and he said, I think there was a time to have the climate progress, and I think that time has passed. Very pessimistic approach, I guess. But with opinions aside, it's also that it's been in the news for so long that many people have just given up, become disillusioned. I know last year, after the floods, even I was disillusioned for a while, because it can just be very disheartening to see setback after setback with little progress. Yeah. But I know that there is hope, and we can make progress. We just have to take the right steps, and we can't hesitate.
Can I add something?
Yeah, okay.
Sorry, I'll be quick. But based on what you were saying, I just would like to add that there is such a huge, miseducation on the way the climate ecosystem works, and the way that climate change is you will hear so many people to this day in 2024, even though science is readily available, you can research things, you can go to a library, we have the internet. There were still people who were like, well, climate change has always existed.
Yeah.
Don't even get me started. But it's well, yes, but people aren't seeing what's happening with the climate crisis as violence, which is, to answer your question, people tend to respond more emotionally and gather in the millions and thousands, hundreds, whatever it is, and fight violence with aggression and passion and anger, whereas there's so much miseducation, misunderstanding, and as Avro was saying, getting bored of this, that they don't see it as violence. So it's oh, well, it's just happening, can't change it, we can't stop it. So I think that's why there's a huge difference in the way it's dealt with and approached. Yeah.
Thank you. Matt, would you like to make any brief comments on that question, or we take another one?
It's a not brief question. But I mean, look, I think we all understand that there are companies around the world that have invested huge amounts of marketing dollars to get to the result that Kalalapa just referenced, right? Injecting doubt into anthropogenic climate change has been at the core of fossil fuel industry proponents for decades now. I think one of our experts in the Juliana case, his name is Gus Speth. He wrote a book called They Knew, which highly recommend everybody read it. It's an adaptation, actually, of his expert report in Juliana versus United States. And it talks about all of the various folks in the United States administrations that knew about the impacts of climate change, and also what happened when they tried to report out on it, the ways in which that information was blocked, misdirected, et cetera. And so I think there has been a large campaign of both disinformation and kind of avoidance that, I think probably your guess is as good as mine, but that is like led us to this kind of complacency. So, my hope is that, with folks like Avro and Kalalapa leading the charge in collective action, that we'll see the kind of change that we've needed for decades now, both in our courts and our legislature and with our executive branches, not just in the United States, but around the world.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thanks,
sir.
Barry.
What, time for one more question, please?
When I first heard about your organization, it struck me that this focus on the youth, next generation, the right to a future, was a strategic, breakthrough in this movement. I'm curious for any of you, but Matt in particular, what are the tipping points strategically going forward that you guys are thinking about? You touched on this a bit when you talked about the state, lawsuits, but what else happens? Will it be, activism? Will it be more court cases, international? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think like we sort of just talked about, we need to be pulling on every single lever in society right now to address this problem, a problem as big and as complex as climate change. And so while I think that the courts are sort of our primary focus and we have the state and federal strategy moving forward, that we think a lot about how do we educate the public, right? Speak both to what Avro said and Kalalapa said, that we need to be teaching each other about actions we can take around climate, about how we can be involved both in government and in sort of civil actions. And I think that you will see I think of it as like kind of a bunch of different columns that sort of support this organizational strategy. Youth-powered climate litigation being one, but also strategic alliances across the country and across the globe with other organizations, not just in the youth movement, but I actually think we really need to be bridging the generations, right? Like we as the adults in the room have a responsibility to Avro and Kalalapa to support them and their futures. So developing strategic alliances that brings that intergenerational bridge to this work is going to be incredibly important, both so that we can teach like the younger generations and so that younger generations can teach us because we have a lot to learn from them. And then also being really, really effective storytellers. I think that I think my colleagues, that some of whom you've heard about tonight, are incredible attorneys because they're very effective storytellers in the courtroom. And I think that we need to bring that narrative campaign to the public, to the media, to schools. I wish I could announce it, but I'm excited about some potential strategic partnerships we have with higher education about developing new curriculum for climate education, both at the university level, but really starting in elementary schools and talking about science and climate in a way that empowers young people to take action. So I think it's going to take pulling on every single lever and, getting back to that original complex question, the fossil fuel industry is an industry of hundreds of billions of dollars, and we are a small nonprofit and with a budget of about $6 million. And so it takes a lot from folks like you all who come out and support us, who tell their friends about our organization, who talk about these cases and support us in whatever way you can. So yeah, I think it is a necessarily complex solution to a complicated problem.
Okay. Would you guys like to make any remarks on that question?
Sure. Sorry, did you want to go? All right.
I'll go.
So, hundreds of billions of dollars and hundreds of billions of lies. That's the fossil fuel industry. They sow the seeds of doubt into our minds, saying there's no good alternative to their energy, to fracking. There's no good alternative to big oil. But there are. And science tells us that, we can do that. But Instead, they bring in pseudoscience, Chevron paying off pseudoscientists to make remarks, just so many things that really work against climate progress. And for what? For money? That's what people prioritize in today's world over the lives of humans, which I think speaks for itself.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I am, as far as what comes next, obviously I agree with what Matt had said about the amount of amazing cases that are going on worldwide. I really encourage you all to, the outside of the US and in the US and possibly in your state, researching it, researching the different cases, researching all of the youth-led litigations that are happening. But also, I recently, like I said, with this case, I've been given so many amazing opportunities. I got to go to Geneva last May and speak to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, that was so cool. I had never left the country before. I met so many amazing, influential people. And I got to speak about our case and why it's important, and I got to tell my story. And then recently, I just was in Barbados, and I spoke to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which is the second time ever leaving the country, and it was also the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Like, I was losing it. I was having such a, I was so happy. It was so cool. But also what I was doing was really important. Later this year, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, if you don't know, they're like in charge of they call them states, but every country between Canada and Argentina, which is a lot, they are issuing an advisory opinion on how the climate crisis is going to be dealt with at an international level within all of these countries, forever. And that's a big deal. So I got to go and talk about our case and talk about the best available science, which I will briefly state, and you can all research it, but it's 350 parts per million, not what the Paris Agreement calls for, which is 1.5 degrees. That's a whole thing. I won't get into that, but I got to talk about that. I got to talk about indigenous and cultural lifeways, and I got to talk about the future for youth. And I also got to talk about individual action because they asked us a question. We were each given 10 minutes to present. And then there was a 15-minute session where they asked us all questions. And there was some amazing scientists from around the world and amazing lawyers. And I just felt like it was such a knowledgeable room. It was so cool. But they asked us about, me and one other youth that was there were asked about how do we, as the Inter-American Court, include individual action within our advisory opinion? And I said that individual action is not possible without institutional action. And I think that goes for all governments. I think it goes for all corporations and anyone who has power, because individual action is important, but it is not possible without the encouragement from larger institutions, the funding from larger institutions, and the education from larger institutions. So I think hopefully if they listen to me, there will be something at an international level, advising countries to include education, real education on real science for the climate crisis at all levels, which is hopefully will help with the future and the solutions. So yeah.
So one final question for you both, and if you could sum it up in a single sentence looking ahead, what would be your message to policymakers and elected officials moving forward?
Is this for us or Matt too?
For you. And then Matt, you can have the closing remarks.
Do you want to go first?
It can be longer than a sentence.
Okay. Yes, I talk in long sentences, if you haven't realized. I don't know. Thank you so much. I think we're probably over time, but thank you for listening to us.
Am I first?
Yeah.
All right. My message to the lawmakers, to the policymakers out there is do what is right. Because we're the future generation.
Thank you.
Period. My message is remember that there is someone who comes after you. Remember that there hopefully will be hundreds and thousands of people who come after you. And the world and this climate ecosystem that we live in, and all of your actions are not only going to affect you. And even if you think that this capitalistic world is so amazing and so cool to have so much money and be in all of this power, you will eventually die because you are human, and then there is something after you. So make decisions based on those people who have to come after and live in the world that you have created for them.
Yeah,
All of them.
leave a good legacy.
Well, yeah.
That's good.
I mean, I don't really need to say anything else after that. But I mean, what really moves me, and whether I'm doing this work or fighting on behalf of trans kids or incarcerated people, is human connection. And I think that one of the things that will help us get through this is building connections with each other, listening to understand each other, and trying to find solutions in each other instead of on our own. And so if I have a message, it's to build connections with each other, because that's how we'll win.
Well, thank you guys. On behalf of the Commonwealth Club and World Affairs, we want to thank you for helping us maintain our tradition of hosting enlightening conversations for 123 years, and keep up the great work that you guys are doing. Thank you.